Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our bite-sized seminar, a tasty little morsel of fascinating research focused on accelerating genomic diagnosis of heart disease. My name is Mara-Jean Tilley, and I have the great privilege of heading up the Garvan Research Foundation, the fundraising and marketing arm of the Garvan Institute of Medical Research, and I'll be your MC today. Before we begin, I'm honoured to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which the Garvan Institute and St Vincent's Hospital are located. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our topic today explores the power of genomics to understand how an individual's genetic variation can impact inherited heart disease, and how we can find ways to communicate and refine this information to improve care for patients and, importantly, their families. And I must say this topic does feel particularly poignant right now with the passing of two very high-profile Australians. Today we have the great privilege and honour of hearing from Associate Professor Jodie Ingles. Jodie is head of the Clinical Genomics Laboratory at the Centre for Population Genomics, an exciting new collaboration between the Garvan Institute of Medical Research and Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Melbourne. Jodie is a talented cardiac genetic counsellor in the Department of Cardiology at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, RPA, with more than 18 years' experience working with families with inherited heart diseases. Jodie's team is focused on finding ways to use cardiac genomics and genetic counselling to improve care, diagnosis, and to refine the risk information for these individuals to ensure that they can have a long and healthy life. In terms of the format for today, we're going to have a presentation from Jodie, followed by 3 questions that the audience can vote on. And it's lovely to see so many familiar faces and new faces in the Zoom room, as well as on the Facebook Live. Welcome, everyone. Jodie, such a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks, Mara-Jean. Excited to be here. I'm not sure I've ever been on Facebook Live before, so I'll try not to be too nervous.
You'll be great.
Excellent. All right, let me share my screen. Okay. Thank you so much to Mara-Jean for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about my research. So I moved across to Garvan in the last 12 months, and I'm really excited to be here. I thought I would introduce the topic by describing a couple of the families that I've gotten to know over my time as a cardiac genetic counsellor that I guess really inspire my research. And I mean, these details have been scrambled a little bit to keep the identities confidential, but I guess the key gist of this is remains. So this is an example. This was a young woman who was home alone with her child during the day, caring for the young child. Unfortunately, had a cardiac arrest during the day and wasn't discovered until later on when her husband returned. She had no pre-existing conditions, and a fairly extensive postmortem failed to identify any cause of death. And this is another family. This is a young teenage boy who was out the night before with some friends, came home late. The next morning, his mother went in to wake him about midday, thinking it was time he should probably be up, and found him deceased in his bed. Again, an extensive postmortem investigation didn't identify any cause of death, which obviously is completely devastating for the families. So when you think about heart disease, most of us, we think about people who, potentially don't have the healthiest of lifestyles, might be overweight, might make poor healthy, lifestyle decisions like to smoke and eat unhealthy food and, have high cholesterol. That's what we think about. We definitely don't think about young people with no risk factors who are otherwise healthy, well people. But this is the patient population that often have inherited causes. We know that inherited heart diseases can cause sudden cardiac death in the young, and we've previously described this happens in about 1.3 per 100,000 individuals in the general population. When it happens in individuals under the age of 35 years, the most common cause in about 40% of cases is that no cause of death is identified at postmortem. And so this leaves the family with no information about why the death occurred, except that we have a strong suspicion that that's an inherited genetic cause. I could go into a lot of detail and spend a lot of time on this, but one of the inherited heart conditions that we deal with is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And this is an issue with the pumping contractile unit of the heart cell. And so if there's a genetic change in one of the proteins that's involved in that contractile unit, then this condition can develop. And it's often characterized by thickening of the left ventricle. So these are conditions that aren't things that you develop later in life, which is really common in the population. These are things that often affect teenagers and young adults. And we know that these conditions are inherited. So this is an example of a family with the dark symbols showing the people in the family who have the condition and showing over generations this being passed along in the family. And this is typical of what we see in our clinics. So I've been seeing families for about 18 years. Clearly I started when I was about 5 years old. And this is clinics that have been run at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital for many years. I started there in 2003. I'm involved obviously as a genetic counsellor, but there's cardiologists, and we've now also got a clinical psychologist involved. And we also have a lot of patient contact through our Australian Genetic Heart Disease Registry. So with these families, because it's genetic, obviously genetic testing can be really useful. And so this is something that clinically as a genetic counsellor, I spend a lot of my time explaining to families the option and helping guide them through the process. So a quick explanation of what this means in this setting is basically what we want to do is we want to identify someone in the family who is the index case, so the person with the most severe and obvious presentation. That's the person we identify, and we call them the proband or the index case. That's the person we need to get a DNA sample from, and we then sequence through a whole number of cardiac genes, and we're looking for one little change in that gene. Now, that seems like a fairly straightforward process, but actually, technically, it's easy enough to do, but interpreting the information that comes from that is the really difficult step. And if I was to sequence my own DNA and my own cardiac genes, what I would find is these rare changes in those genes that just happen naturally, because that's, they're the changes that I have, and we all have our own unique variation. So working out which of those changes is there because it's the cause of a disease and which is just there by chance is the thing that we spend a lot of time doing, and something that genetic counsellors especially spend a lot of time doing. And we have this fairly extensive criteria to help determine if there's enough evidence to say with certainty that yes, this is definitely the cause of disease, or with certainty that no, this is not the cause of disease. And everything else ends up in a grey area where we're really uncertain as to whether it's the cause or not. And they're the pain in the backside gene results that don't really help anything and can often cause a lot of confusion. So if we get enough certainty in a change in one of these genes and we can use it in the family, it can be a really powerful tool. So it can allow us to see who does or does not carry that one specific genetic change. If someone does carry that change, we know that they need to continue to have surveillance with a cardiologist throughout their lifetime, and that their kids are now at risk. And if they don't, they can be released from all future clinical screening and worry about whether they might develop that condition in future. And also that their kids can't have inherited that, because you can't pass on something that you don't have. So this is the end goal of genetic testing. It's really useful, and you can see why it's so important that we get the the genetic change absolutely correct, because if we use this in the family to make such important decisions that as people being released from clinical screening, then we want to make sure that we're absolutely right. And this is actually something that we've shown quite a long time ago now, in 2011, but we actually showed that this is cost effective. So even though genetic testing, and especially back in 2011, was an expensive addition to clinical management, but it actually allows you to release a lot of people from needing ongoing appointments with the cardiologist to determine if they're developing these conditions. So it's a really useful aspect of management. So my group has always been motivated by the families that we're seeing in clinic to try to better understand, how we can best look after these families. And one of the things we really like to try to do is use genomics and genetic testing to diagnose cardiac diseases. The other thing that, because we can get a result then that is really useful for the family and, potentially provide an explanation for why that person has the disease and what the disease is. The second thing that we're becoming much more interested in is, can we use that genetic information to, understand who might be at risk of sudden death, or better determine who should be on what medications, or who might need certain investigations because they might be slightly more at risk, for example, of developing atrial fibrillation or having a stroke or something like that. So there's a lot of opportunity potentially to use genomics in that space as well, which isn't really done much in our field. But the interesting thing is, even if we were able to 100% understand how to use genomics in a family, as a genetic counsellor, I see all of the reasons why this is not enough, because there are so many other factors that we need to consider in how, before this can even be completely implemented into the clinic. So, for example, the process of genetic testing and who can access it is something that we don't have a really good handle on at the moment. Being able to communicate this information really effectively to patients and then help support them to communicate that to their family members is something we don't do good enough at the moment either. So we can we can have all the answers and give that back to the families, but if they don't understand it or aren't supported to use it, then what's the point of it? We know that there's an enormous amount of health disparities with this sort of information, and I'll touch on that a little bit in the next few slides. We know that people need access to genetic counselling, but genetic counselling is a bit of a niche field at the moment. There's certainly not enough genetic counsellors around to manage all of this. As you heard from the first few families that I described, the psychological impact of living with some of these inherited heart conditions for some of our families, especially where they've experienced a sudden death, can be really traumatic. And so for a person who's grieving and has been through a really traumatic experience, the ability to cognitively even comprehend what this complicated genetic information means is really tricky as well. So that's something that we need to be able to attend to first before we even throw in complicated genetics. And then we need to understand how we implement all of this into the clinic in the most efficient, cost-effective, but useful, beneficial way that we can. So my group is focused on all of these things. And this is kind of my approach to research, where I like to just do all of the studies and try and understand everything. But I'll give you a few little high-level examples of some of these. So one study that I'm really excited about is called the Elusive Heart Study. And this is where we're using genomics and whole genome sequencing to try to make a diagnosis in families that have, I guess, exhausted all options so far of understanding what the disease is in their family. This is something that we've had some pilot funding from the patient organisation Heart Kids, and we've got about 15 families already that have these really significant family histories, especially with the index case being a child, often presenting with a cardiac arrest and have had genetic testing and nothing identified. So we've got 2 families already of those 15 where our whole genome sequencing has actually managed to make a diagnosis, and which is really exciting. It gives an answer for the family. It allows the cardiologist to better manage and treat the patient, and then it allows options for the family members to be able to have cascade genetic testing as well. Another study that we're hoping will be published in the next few months is using genetic information to predict those people who are most at risk of ventricular arrhythmias or a cardiac arrest. So this is an exciting study where we looked at individuals who have an arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy, and which is caused by a truncating variant in a gene called desmoplakin. And we actually gathered cases from around Australia, from Stanford in the United States, the Royal Brompton Hospital in the UK, and a whole bunch of Netherlands cardiogenetics clinics, and ended up with about 100 patients, which for a fairly rare condition is quite a lot. We were interested in where exactly the truncating variant occurs in this gene called desmoplakin. So desmoplakin is a protein that holds the cells together, and which is obviously important because they have to beat. So there's a lot of mechanical force with those cells. And we found that the patients who have truncating variants in these red and blue regions of desmoplakin are much more at risk of having an arrhythmia compared to patients with a truncating variant in the end of the tail region of the protein. And there's quite a few interesting mechanistic things there that can help explain that, but potentially it has a really important implication in identifying those who might be at risk of cardiac arrest as well. We know that from some of the work that one of my PhD students, Alex Butters, has done, that people who are not white, so people from more diverse ancestry groups, one, they're less likely to access genetic testing in the first place, but even if they can get genetic testing, they're 2 to 3 times more likely to have an uncertain variant. So that is a variant in that gray area where we don't really know whether it's definitely the cause or definitely not the cause. And that's a problem because you can't use those. You can't use that in the family like you can with an informative result. And there's also a risk that the lab can misclassify that and get it wrong, and that can cause really significant harm. So this is a pretty major disparity at the moment, and something that we're working towards getting better data for so that we can not have this disparity. Another project we're working on is from another PhD student, Laura Yates, who's also a genetic counselor, and she's looking at we've done some co-design with stakeholders, so patients and clinicians, to try to work out how can we support families who've experienced a young sudden cardiac death to help them adjust and deal with the fairly significant and traumatic psychological challenges after that. And so we've come up with this idea for a website that'll have lots of information, especially to normalize what the impact of these deaths are and where they can get information, which hasn't always been entirely clear. And we've also got a 4-session online support psychological intervention that's run by clinical psychologists and genetic counselors that we're about to start piloting. And so I think this is going to have a huge impact for the families and at least help them to, adjust and understand the information that we need to convey to them. We've just launched a really big study called New South Wales Hearts, and this is a cohort study across the entire state where we're hoping to find people who have inherited cardiomyopathies. We're going to collect an enormous amount of information from them and then follow them through time. And this will be a really unique way to better understand some of these diseases. We're really hoping to find people who don't necessarily come to the big hospitals in the city to get more diverse representation for this. And if anyone's interested in this, the website is there. So the reason we do all of this, I think, is pretty nicely summed up in this Guardian article from a mother who had lost her son at the age of 15 from an inherited cardiac cause. And she says that knowing the true cause has enabled me at last to think of his life as complete, the one that was for him, tragically short but rich and fabulous in its entirety. I find I can accept the randomness of error, the unluckiness of it all, although I'm acutely aware that we are so much luckier than others. And this is essentially why we do what we do, because if we can give answers to families, it means the world to them. So this is our motivation. Huge thank you to my team who do all of the work. I just talk about it. They're amazing. And huge thanks to all of our collaborators and funders. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jodie. Really incredible presentation. Thank you so much for sharing. On the last point you've touched on there, I mean, within medical research, we do talk a lot about resilience and handling the kind of trials and tribulations of being a medical researcher. How do you and your colleagues cope with the kind of issues that you're dealing with every day in the clinic with these families? What are the tools that you employ to keep your own well-being?
Yeah, it's actually a really, really good question. And unfortunately, it's not something that's written down. And as a genetic counselor, I was probably one of the first in the world even working in cardiac in 2003. And so there was no rule book about how you do this. And so we've had to work it out as we go. And there's things like, if we'd had some things in the media about our research, and we were getting a lot of calls from families who had this happen in their family, but they'd never been referred anywhere for information. If we take too many of those calls in one day, you basically start absorbing all of it, and that's not effective for anyone. So there's a lot of clinical supervision that becomes really important. And the PhD student I mentioned, Laura Yates, is actually about to start a study where we can qualitatively assess the impact of that on cardiac genetic counselors, and hopefully turn that into some recommendations so that new people coming into the field don't burn out and take on all of this. But it's awful. But at the same time, I love it because we actually get to be there for these families when everyone is not even wanting to mention the deceased name and not wanting to ask them about it. And they actually, they just need someone to talk to about it, and we can help them at their most rock bottom point of their life.
Yeah, what a special job that is to be able to do. You spoke about, I guess, equity and the disparity of largely non-white individuals in not only accessing perhaps appropriate clinical interventions, but actually having a robust diagnosis. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a really stark finding. And we've recently repeated that in a different subset of our patients and found exactly the same thing. One of the goals of the Centre for Population Genomics is to develop a reference database that better reflects, the ancestry groups that are more common in Australia. So we're a very multicultural community. One of the things that we do when we find these, genetic changes that we all have, is if we know in the general population how often they occur, that can help guide in knowing what is truly rare. So if we've got an enormous, 100,000 white people where we've got their genome sequencing data and they don't have any obvious genetic diseases, knowing the frequency of these rare changes in them is really useful. But that's not necessarily going to be helpful if we're seeing people from different ancestry groups. So we need those people included in these reference populations so that we can be more accurate in knowing whether their changes are truly disease causing, or if they're just there by chance.
Yeah, amazing. What do you think the future of your research looks like? Will there be a point where we know everything we need to know about cardiac disease and you can move on to something else?
That would be great. I find the more I learn about genetics, the more complicated it is, and the more we realize what we don't know. So I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. But even as I said, even if we did understand all of this, there are so many social aspects to it that, we need better ways of being able to get this information to people. So even if we did understand things perfectly, there's still so much work in, implementation that I think I could do this job for about 10 lifetimes and hopefully, put a small dent in it.
Gosh, sobering, but it's good to have the full facts. We've got a pre-submitted question for you, Jodie. So there are a lot of people with I don't know if I can pronounce that. Busupic valves. You must know what that means.
Bicuspid.
Beautiful,
yes,
thank you. Who are much more vulnerable to problems if they push themselves too much when young. Can genetic testing identify the genes responsible for these valves and track down family members to discourage them from excessive activity and the risk of sudden death?
So bicuspid aortic valves is, instead of having, it is where you have 2 leaflets, I think, instead of 3. And again, I'm not a cardiologist and I don't see too many patients with this. So if I've got the details wrong, don't hold me to it. It's not, from what we understand, a strongly genetic thing. So it's one of those things where you would have to be careful in not in understanding whether it's something that really does put you at risk. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be something to talk to a GP or a cardiologist about. We don't want to limit people from physical activity where we don't need to, because physical activity itself is really important for heart health. So if we are limiting people, there needs to be a really, really good reason, because the chance of them becoming sedentary and getting other cardiovascular diseases is a really, well-known and well understood risk. So I can't comment on this disease specifically, but you would have to probably talk to a cardiologist.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, Jodie. Now, we are running out of time, and I have assured our guests that we will keep to the 30-minute bite-size science. But I guess for you, you mentioned the families are really important for your research. What gets you out of bed every day? Is it the families? Is it the scientific discovery? Is it a combination of all of it?
It's definitely all of it. Probably my favorite thing is to try to find the genetic causes. So actually looking at the genetic changes and doing all of that work of finding the evidence of whether this particular genetic change is the cause or not. You can really get wrapped up in it. It's kind of like detective work, like really nerdy genetic detective work, where you're kind of building an evidence base for whether a particular genetic change is a cause or not. And as a genetic counselor and as a researcher, I absolutely love that, and then also because I'm in this really special, I guess, role where if we do find something, I'm the one that gets to tell the family that myself. And I love that because it's the best. Giving them answers is great.
What an honour. Well, Jodie, you are amazing. Associate Professor Detective Jodie, thank you very much for joining us. It's just been wonderful. And to all of our wonderful audience participants, thank you for joining us. We really indebted to you for your support, for your philanthropic support, for your time, for your advocacy, for your interest. It means a great deal to our scientists such as Jodie, and we really thank you for that. Now, of course, many of you are already donating, and we're so grateful for your support. I see that we also have a number of our partners for the future in the audience. Thank you for being here and for everything you do for Garvan. If you are not yet a donor to Garvan or a partner for the future and you'd like to learn more, please do get in touch. Send us an email, give us a call. We'd love to hear from you. In terms of the seminar series, we're always looking for ways to improve. So we will be sharing with you very shortly a survey. Please do give us your full and frank feedback. All feedback is a gift. And if you have any questions that have not been answered through the course of today's session, please do pop your question into the survey along with your email address and your name, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. We will be hosting more seminars virtually, but hopefully also in real life in the second half of this year, COVID permitting. So please keep an eye out for those upcoming events on our website or give us a call. We'd love to hear from you. Jodie, once again, thank you. And we hope to see all of you very soon. Stay safe, stay well. Have a great day.